This talk by Ushmita today, who's curated the show on the designer Riten Mozumdar, titled Imprint, we wanted to integrate it within our design histories of modern and contemporary India symposium. So I'm delighted that this could take place and that we can actually sit in the gallery surrounded by the works, the exhibits, and Ushmita and I can actually be next to each other for this one session because the rest is all online where we're all sitting in different parts. Let me briefly introduce Ushmita, who must be known to all of you listening today. She's currently director and head curator of Imami Art Kolkata. She comes from a background in fine arts from Kala Bhavan, Shantini. And she has worked as an artist, art writer, researcher, and independent curator for several years before she joined Imami Art. Ushmita also has now attained the status of being a Riten Mozumdar scholar, in the sense that she has been extensively researching the career of Riten Mozumdar for some years, has already published some pieces on him. But it is 2 years ago, or now maybe slightly more before the lockdown, that she was able to curate this exhibition on a different scale at a gallery in Mumbai, Chatterjee and Lal. And it is this exhibition that has traveled here and, of course, taken on a different scale. So we are delighted to integrate this talk within our symposium. And I will let Ushmita now take over and speak about both the historical background and the specific journey of Riten Mozumdar as artist, sculptor, and designer. Her talk is called A Singular Journey, the career of the polymath designer, Riten Mozumdar. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. B, and thank you everyone for your patience. So without more ado, I will share screen. So we are also live on Facebook. That's good. So today's talk, as Dr. B has just mentioned, is called A Singular Journey, the career and life of polymath artist designer Riten Mozumdar. My talk is divided roughly into two parts. The first being a context for the growth of practices like Riten Mozumdar, why he was important, why he became an artist, what influences can be seen within such artistic practices or design practices. And the other part talks about his career in particular. So I start with these two quotes, one by Jaya Appaswamy and the other by Professor Ashok Chatterjee, that there are few contemporary designers in India who can claim to have helped to create modern taste, and Riten Mozumdar is outstanding amongst them. And Professor Ashok Chatterjee, in an interview, told me that documenting designers like Riten Mozumdar is critical to the understanding of contemporary design, and that at the moment there is little or no access, understanding, or awareness of what the pioneers did to open the space that newer generations now enjoy. Their sense of heritage is about the distant past, not the post-independence period preceding the founding of NID. I would like to give a little background to my research. I am not from a design background. As Tapati mentioned, I studied art. But I had seen some works by Riten, and when I started researching his works, I was amazed by every layer that I was uncovering. But I also understood that to understand practices like his, one needed to contextualize, one needed to understand. So then I posed these four very basic questions to myself. Why was Riten Mozumdar an important designer? I mean, what did we understand by contemporary design in the context of the time? And what factors might have contributed to creating a modernist design idiom in India? And hence, from there, can a practice act as a map of multiple trajectories and complex global exchange and help to understand the larger context? So I have put together a few landmark years from his biography, which is quite extensive. But he was born in 1927 in Kasur, Punjab, in undivided India, and he passed away in 2006 in Shantiniketan. But his studentship and his studies actually again start from Shantiniketan in the 1940s. Hence, I'm trying to create this map which runs a full circle from an undivided India through the independence struggle in Shantiniketan where he's studying, and again back to Shantiniketan towards the end of his life. And in the interim period, he becomes this designer who practices and who shows exhibits all across the world. He's part of exhibitions in New York, in Finland, in Stockholm. He's also important and part of almost all public sector engagements of the time, such as All India Handicrafts Board, cottage emporiums, weaver service centers. He's part of trade fairs, ITBC programming. He also consults privately for several important bodies such as Taru, Fab India, Design Thai. And then he also has his own private practice where, as an artist, where he makes these calligraphic paintings, namdas. So in a sense, if one were to make a timeline, he starts from pre-independence India, and then he ends in his career, his flourishing career comes to a kind of a retired space within the 1980s. So to understand what happens in those years across India and the world that influences and gives rise to modern design practices is something that was very, very important to me. So I kind of put the 1920s in the center of the arc that I draw, and I go a little back. I go back to understanding where this word design first enters into the Indian institutional context. As some of you may have heard, Professor Ashok Chatterjee say the other day that design as a word really does not exist in the Indian context, in the Indian traditional context. But in May 1st, 1850, the Madras School of Art opened, and when it opened an industrial art section, the term design was added to the school's name. So this word entered during 1854, 1857, 1866, as these industrial art colleges started coming up in Madras, in Bombay, in Calcutta, and these provided mechanical arts training for young men. So this is the colonial aspect of it. But what happens is around this time, and from the 1905, when E.B. Havel heads the Madras School and later the Government School of Art in Calcutta, he obviously he looks at the Indian art and indigenous design and crafts as the main model rather than the Western pedagogical constraints that were prevalent. And he was aided in this by Abanindranath. Also, around the same time, Ananda Kumaraswamy he talks about the deeper meaning of the struggle, whose title was borrowed from a pamphlet by William Morris. And he also agitated for cultural nationalism that would renew the economic, social, and religious conditions of India's distinct identity as the only way to counter industrial capitalism. And then we have Abanindranath Tagore, who obviously became the first major exponent of the Swadeshi values. So here is a setting that is set, and within this setting, obviously we have Tagore and Gandhi both come and start on one hand, Tagore conceives of a national education, which he starts his school in Shantiniketan and later Kala Bhavan, which is again based on the Bauhaus principles. And on the other hand, Gandhi emphasizes the national and public importance of crafts, directly informed his whole campaign to encourage hand-spun clothes as a commitment to Swadeshi or Indian handmade goods. So both of them were conceiving of a craft-based education as a humanist alternative to the elitism of colonial education. In Shantiniketan, the school that Rabindranath starts, and then from there, the two Sriniketan and Kalabhavan in Shantiniketan, these both give quite a great importance to crafts. Nandalal Bose especially adds crafts to the curriculum, and it results in the realization of various traditional techniques. He believed the design of everyday objects molded the sensibility of the community. This is a quote by R. Shivakumar, Shantiniketan, The Making of a Contextual Modernism. Around the same time as the Swadeshi movement gains purchase, Nandalal Bose was commissioned by Gandhi to create the art accessible to the common people. And in the INC session at Haripura, Nandalal makes these amazing posters that are influenced by folk traditions that include elements of the folk and local materials. As again, I quote Professor Shivakumar, Nandalal Bose looked at cultural idioms and the fabric of the common man when he created images of musicians, blacksmiths, tailors, an esraj player, a veena player, or woman doing their chores. One of the finest amongst them is the bullfighter. So he added the deceptively simple in appearance and invoking the flavor of folk painting. The Haripura posters are an amalgamation of decorative and calligraphic art with a rare ingenuity and personal insignia. So I'm kind of trying to put these flag marks that starts with the Swadeshi movement that gains purchase with Tagore, Shantiniketan, the three masters who are the teachers there. Also the Swadeshi movement beyond with Gandhi's struggle for freedom. And again, those who have attended the earlier sessions have heard Professor Chatterjee talk about the fact that craft and design, actually contemporary or modern design, started in Shantiniketan or in Sriniketan. And the Tagore family had a great involvement in this with the crafts in modern India. And Abanindranath and Gaganendranath were inspired by their uncle. Ratindranath, Rabindranath's son, was also designed, as you can see the slide on the upper slide, which is the Udayan dining room, which was designed by Ratindranath and Shurenkor in early 1900s. They also began to document the artistic and literary practices of rural Bengal, and this led to them to notice that these were not discrete practices, but a coherent cultural expression of a people. I quote these from Professor R. Shivakumar's Crafts and Sustainable Development, the Shantiniketan Legacy. Stretching that to the architecture, and I want to talk about architecture at this point because architecture in modern India becomes a very important element of expression of modernism. And it perhaps starts from, again, from Shantiniketan, where Tagore builds the, Udayan, which sets within a modernist framework where it is a synthesis of many different traditions such as Indian, Japanese, Javanese, and European traditions. I would also like to bring into take a moment to talk about Mingei, or a philosophy that developed in the mid 1920s in Japan, and this challenged that a society's definition of what is art and what is craft. It was especially important because I have noted down these 3 points here, and I would like you to remember the slide on the left, the image on the left, which is a Japanese Norrin curtain. This becomes important because in 1960s, when Riten Mozumdar visits Japan, and I will come to that later, he's greatly influenced by the Mingei tradition. He's greatly influenced by Japanese traditional art form. And obviously there is a great influence of Japanese art and craft within the Kala Bhavan and the Shantiniketan traditions as well. But what is also important is that although Mingei was handmade, it was produced in large quantities. So this was a very important element within Mozumdar's practice. It was inexpensive, simple, practical in design, and although it was not a luxurious item, but simple and inexpensive. And I think these tied in so well with the Swadeshi ideal, but also later the Nehruvian ideal. The other flag point that I want to focus on is Bauhaus, because Bauhaus becomes a very, very important design influence in Indian modernist design, especially NID at a later point. But we also must not forget that Tagore had visited Bauhaus, and obviously the Bauhaus and how it functioned influenced a lot of what Kala Bhavan came to be at a later point. So this is a quote by Walter Gropius when he founded Bauhaus in 1919. He said, "Let us create a new guild of craftsmen without the class distinction which raise an arrogant barrier between craftsmen and artists." And again, I would like to underscore this aspect, this distinction between craftsmen and artists. And these are points that have been raised again and again in the Design History Symposium. But also when I was researching Riten Mozumdar, this is a point that kept coming up. Many of his friends said that he was very disturbed by the idea that he approached design like an artist, but there was always this distinction that he was never considered an artist, but always just a designer. So this was a very, very interesting point of connection between the two. Rabindranath visits Bauhaus, and then the Bauhaus exhibition comes to Kolkata, which is again a very, very important point. Then I think this is perhaps the first moment that international modernist art comes to India. And this is the first moment that also influences a lot of art going forward, especially modern Indian art. In Bauhaus, Joseph Albers is obviously a very important pedagogue, and he influences, and his theories on art do influence a lot of the minimalist and the abstract art of the 1960s. And I have put this together, especially if those who are present in the gallery can see some examples on the wall of works done by Mozumdar here. And I can make these connections, I can make these links. So this again is an important marker of influences that seep into our artistic and design practices. From there, I would like to come to the post-independent moment. What happens once India is free? Nehru comes up with 5-year plans within which, of course, as he says, the future has to be built on the foundations laid in the past. And it is very important for Nehru to look towards the past, to look towards developing the craft sector, to look to not only have industrialization, but also look at the hinterland for answers. So here there are these important people. Here is Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who was obviously so important in how the independent India looked at and formulated the crafts sector going forward. And then from on the right, you see the images. What happened? On the right are these images from Central Cottage Industries Emporium in the 1950s. But what is very interesting is this is Gulshan Nanda on the right-hand bottom slide. When I spoke with her, she knew Riten Mozumdar and she had worked with him during the cottage industries days. And she talked about the women refugees at the Kingsway camp and how sewing and knitting and fulkari became a craft, became a tool for rehabilitation. Around the same time, and this is very important because I'll just go quickly to the next slide first, and I'll read Professor Ashok Chatterjee's quotation, that craft also became a vehicle in free India's cultural diplomacy. In 1955, an exhibition was curated by Pupul Jaikar for the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, in New York. And this is where Jaikar actually encounters Charles and Ray Eames. But going back, in the 1950s, MoMA showcases these exhibitions, one of which is Textiles and Ornamental Arts in India, which is held in 1955. And the other is also Japanese household objects in 1951. And this becomes again important landmark moment that, as Professor Ashok Chatterjee, if I go on to the next slide, it becomes a very important idea that we are looking at crafts practices from non-Western perspectives. Meeting Charles and Ray Eames becomes important. They come to India on the invitation of Nehru, and they go and look at these, they study our traditions and they look at the lota from which comes the India report. And India report is what NID leads to NID and the design colleges in India. Another important marker is the Scandinavian designs. And here we have designers like Helena Perenthupa, who comes to India, who becomes a teacher at NID, and she becomes a very, very influential teacher. Of course, she's also involved in the Javaja project, which Professor Ashok Chatterjee had spoken about. And Scandinavian design becomes very important. In a sense, many of Riten Mozumdar's contemporary designers traveled to Scandinavia. Especially important among these was Minnie Boga, who started Taru Furniture. For them, Scandinavian design, which is very interestingly also linked to Japanese design, traditional design, is very minimal, fuss-free, straight in lines. And this is what contemporary designers of the time were looking at, this idiom that was very fuss-free, but that was also minimal. So India was changing. India was a new country. It was a young country, and it was looking to grow in both directions, industrial as well as the craft sector and the traditional sectors. But it was also a time where a lot of documentation was being done, whether in the craft sector, such as the Javaja project, which was done in Rajasthan, or these are photographs by Sunil Jana, and all the 5-year plans that Nehru modernization agenda included. These were all recorded and photographed. So these become important markers in the modernist agenda of India. And another part was architecture. As I mentioned earlier, when I showed Tagore's Udayon, these became the modern architectures of India, where architects like Achyut Kanvinde or Habib Rahman, who learned both actually, who were both taught by Gropius at Harvard and Massachusetts Institute of Technology, they come back with this, they brought back this Bauhaus idiom or tradition to India. And this becomes the architectural modernist moment. And this is before Corbusier comes to India, of course. And then one sees that Ahmedabad, Delhi, Chandigarh become the core areas of architectural, modernist architectural development. So when architecture is developing in a different way, the design that populates these architectures also changes. Hence, Riten Mozumdar and his contemporaries like Shona Adhikari, Shona Ray, also were looking at design in a very, very different, in a different way. These are different architectures, again, photographed by Madan Mahata in Delhi, Hindustan Times building and Ashoka Hotel. So a very different architecture, a very different time, a very different modern design aesthetics in different formats, whether it is industry, whether it is photography, whether it is architecture, and then what comes inside those architectures, that is also changing. So here on the left, we have this photograph of John Bissell, Shona Ray, and Bharti Sharma. John Bissell, who founded Fab India. Shona Ray was a great friend of Riten Mozumdar. Bharti Sharma was his partner in a business called Pallavi. So these important, again, as I've come to understand, there were no designers as we understand. There was not a niche practice like we understand. Every designer was doing multiple things. So somebody like Riten Mozumdar would have designed furniture, he would have worked for, he would have designed clothes, and he would have designed, as you see, bed linen, and also done his own studio practices. So design was a very fluid and flexible area at the time. We also see the right-hand side, bottom right-hand side photograph is of Fab India shop when it started, and most of the designs that you see there were designed by Riten Mozumdar. So having set the stage, I arrived at Riten's practice, and this is a slide which, it's a conceit on my part that I try to make these connections, make these different points that I just raised. And a single person's practice or even design as a field at the time is influenced by multiple things. It's something that comes from within the culture, from within India, but also something that many things that come from outside. But sometimes the influences are direct, but sometimes they travel. So, for instance, Tagore and Kalabhavan and Minge, there is that sublimation of that, but also Riten traveled to Japan in the 1960s. His work, when you look at his work, especially his namdas, most people feel that they are influenced by either Tantra. But I find this influence, I find this deep resonance. I wouldn't call it influence, but a deep resonance of minimalist abstract art of the 1960s, especially Rothko and Albers that we saw. So there are these, various influences that are simmering together to give rise to a new nation's idea of design practices, and also Riten Mozumdar himself. Coming back to his early years, He starts college. Comes to study in Shantiniketan in the 1940s, and this photograph in the right is with his sister Shuchita Kripalani, who was also a very renowned freedom fighter. And on the left, the photograph is Riten Mozumdar with Binod Bihari, who remained his very close confidant for till the end of his life. So as he starts his he starts as a student in Kala Bhavan, he goes through the curriculum there, and these are some examples from that period. On the left is the untitled or Chalta flowers that he mentions in one of his memoirs in Shruti Smriti. It's a tempera painting, and on the right is Shimul Pool. What is interesting is this is a quote from Shruti Smriti, and the left side it's Bangla, but I have made a simple translation. And this says that he learned these designs under Gauri Bhanjo, who was Nandalal's daughter. And he says that Gauri Di was a conscientious teacher. She had a clear hand, but a particular style which was very set, and she did not like to venture beyond that. In traditional ornamental style and no exploration beyond that whatsoever. I did not particularly like these design classes and often played truant. Once I was supposed to design a full-size layout for a batik bed cover, so I told her, I shall use bamboo motifs for my design. And she replied, it is not possible to make it with bamboo. And they had a little bit of a spat about this. And later, Master Moshai or Nandalal Bose called him, and he said that I will teach you how to make a design using bamboo motif. And he demonstrated some excellent patterns. Why I especially quote this is very interesting, because at this moment he says that he did not like design practices very much, and he did not like a particular kind of design that was being taught by Gauri Bhanjo, Gauri Di. But what happens is, and I will come to it, so hold this thought about bamboo, this small anecdote about bamboo, which then plays a very interesting role in his career, and we keep seeing the repetition of the bamboo motif or the Benu motif that he continually comes back to again and again. The cooperative tea shop, terracotta bar relief done in Ramkinkar Bege's class. So from there, he moves, while he's studying in Shantiniketan, his teacher that he's the closest to, Binod Bihari, moves to Nepal, the Nepal Museum, and Riten Mozumdar joins him along with Leela Mukherjee and another student. They go and spend some time there, and here Riten learns a lot of traditional crafts under a master craftsman called Kulasundar Shilakarni. He learns metal cast, beaten metal work, painting, banner painting, calligraphy, wood carving. And it is here that he starts appreciating what craft actually means and what traditional crafts entail. So he cites this period as something really important in his career. This is, as I said, he remained very, very close to Binodda. And this was an eulogy, this is a part of an eulogy that he wrote for Binodda when he passed away in 1981. And here also in the middle page, he writes, I went back to Nepal after finishing my studies at Kala Bhavan. So he goes first, he returns back, and then he goes again before Binodda, and he come back to India finally and settle in Delhi and Mussoorie. So Binodda sits alone in Kathmandu, walking across the mountains. I reach the Kathmandu Valley after dark. So he writes about this. And I heard the sound of a car and rushed out. Vinodda had come with a Nepalese friend in a taxi to fetch me. So such was their close encounter and friendship. And then he also talks about how Vinodda went blind when he was in Europe. And but what is interesting is that when they both come to Mussoorie, this is what he writes. Finally, he here means Vinod Bihari Mukherjee started a summer school in Mussoorie. This is the time he made designs for block printing on cloth. I started to get both his and my designs printed. My knowledge of the medium was very limited then. The prints sold well, but not enough to give him a living. So it's very interesting what he says here, because I have found in the early periods that there is they work together, they exhibit together, but there are also instances where Riten Mozumdar is using the blocks that are very typically Vinod Bihari. So as you can see here, this is the catalog cover of the Delhi Shilpi Chakra from the 1951, and these block prints are by Vinod Bihari. But I have found these block prints being used in wall hangings that he made, Riten Mazumdar made. Unfortunately, I do not have access to the images, but I've seen it in collector's house. And these blocks were used to make these beautiful silk hangings. Around the same time, in the early 1950s, Riten starts working on several projects. One important among this is the Post and Telegraph Centenary Exhibition. He starts doing sculpture, and these are some. On the right hand side is a block print by Riten Mozumdar. But I just wanted to put Herbert Percy Horn's design next to it. So we do see again, this tradition that starts in Shantiniketan through Vinod Bihari, and that Riten Mozumdar carried forward. We do find similarities of it in certain design practices. This is from the same design that appears in the Illustrated Weekly of India. And here, the left-hand side one, where there's a small bird motif, is again Vinod Bihari's blog, but this has been used several times by Riten Mozumdar in many of his earlier works. In this period, he also does wood carving, toys, fabric. He's also part of the Museum of Modern Art, Textiles and Ornamental Arts of India exhibition, the small photograph that I had shown earlier. And unfortunately, the records do not show his name. This is on the left-hand side is the Museum of Modern Art, and it mentions that the works were chosen by Edgar Kaufman Jr. And on the right is a biodata that has been typed and corrected by Riten Mozumdar. And it also mentions that he showed his works in the Living India exhibition, and his works were selected by Mr. Edward Kaufman Jr. But I do not have, I've still not been able to access what works exactly were shown by him there. This is a book from 1959, Handicrafts of India, edited by Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay. And the image shows the toys and the textile designed by him. And the text says, the wood carvings on this page display the remarkable adaptability of Indian craftsmen to modern trends in taste and design, the creations of Riten Mozumdar. These decorative pieces of humans and animals employ a bold, stylized, almost cubistic form while retaining the character of traditional Indian ideas. So at this time, because he's doing so well, he's exhibiting, he's made a name for himself. He gets a scholarship to study abroad, and he goes to study at the Fine Arts Academy at Ljubljana in Yugoslavia in 1956. under the sculptor Boris Callan, and you can see how different how his language changes. If I can quickly go back to the sculptures that he's making just a few years back, uh, you see how he develops. And in later period, many of his friends say that he referred to himself as an artist sculptor. While in Yugoslavia, he travels and he also visits. He also did a book cover illustration. He travels around Yugoslavia, and then he goes to Finland, and he's working in a ceramics factory when Arni Ratia, who's the founder of Marimekko, and it was called Printex Marimekko at the point. She goes and she hears that there's this Indian designer who's here, and she goes and meets him, and then Riten is invited and he works at Marimekko for several months. I find this slide very important because this kind of marks bifurcation in how he moves forward now. The design that is spread on the table in the photograph on the left shows the influences of his teacher, of Vinod Bihari, of a certain language of the Shantiniketan school. And one of the early designs that he made there, which the Marimekko archives have shared with me, as you can see, the language does still owe some influences to his teacher and to his schooling. While he's there, he learns the new techniques of silkscreen. This was a technique that Marimekko was famous for, and he designs this amazingly beautiful textile called fish. And most of these textiles carried the name of the designer on the sides. Those who are present here, and you can see the work, the print, we have it exhibited on the wall there. You can see his name on the edges. But from here, his design ethos, to my eyes, starts changing. It becomes very simplified. It becomes more about the essence. And we come to this design that is Benu Bono, the bamboo. And this is why I wanted to share with you that small anecdote about his argument with Gauri Bhanjo and how he wanted to make a design with bamboo. And this bamboo motif then keeps recurring throughout his career. But look at, these are the image on the left and in the center are from the Marimekko archives. These are the designs that he made there. He made around 6 designs for them. The one in the center is, of course, Benu Bono. But what's also interesting that these are made in 1956, 57. But on the extreme right, the archives also shared with me that in 2013, they had revived this particular design of Benu Bono once again. And this was used in their apparel. So it just goes to show that the designs that he was making were timeless. The way he approached the language of the print is so contemporary even now. We had some visitors in the exhibition and somebody just wanted to wear these dresses and they said, they don't appear as if they were made so many years ago. So I think that's a very, very important thing about Riten Mozumdar's designs. The same Benu Bono is reviewed. This design is reviewed in 1957 in a Finnish newspaper. And on the left, he is with 2 other very important Finnish designers, Antti and Vuokko Niemi. Did we get logged out? Yes, we got logged out. But I'm not here anymore. Sorry? I got logged out. Yeah. So Antti and Vuokko Nurminiemi were also very important, and they, as Finnish designers, and they visited India, and he worked with them for some time. The bamboo design block. So I have found this bamboo block, and on the left is a paper on which he has made the print using this as a block. So bamboo keeps recurring in his work, the motif of bamboo. This is a skirt that he designed for Pallavi, the label that he designed for with Bharti Sharma. And on the right is a design called the Narkul series, but this is from Fab India, later in 1970s and 80s. While he's traveling in Italy, and this again, I want to show these 4 slides. These are from different time periods. There's the Piazza della Civiltà Italiana photograph by Riten Mozumdar from 1956-57, while he's traveling through Europe. Then the Jaffrey design that he makes at Marimekko. He comes back and he designs this sari for Monica Correa, which is called Rome by Night. And the use of a simplified design motif becomes so forward. When he's returning from Europe, he meets Charles Correa in 1960 on the ship. And according to Monica Correa, they strike a conversation and they become friends for life. So Charles even later designed his house in Delhi and friends. And both of them represented India at the World Design Conference in Tokyo in 1960. And Mozumdar wrote a report, and in this he wrote this. Currently, there is a strong revivalist movement of folk designs among the craftsmen and craft designers of Kyoto, and individuality plays a great role in the works of the craftsmen. The standard of execution in Japan, whether in the crafts or industrial production or in architecture, is very high. Graphic art in Japan has a marked originality. The calligraphic quality of Japanese works of graphic designers makers these quite distinct from the graphics of other countries. So here he's talking about quite a few things. He's talking about revival of crafts and craft traditions. He's talking about industrial or craft handmade production and architecture. He's also talking about the individuality and originality and calligraphy. Monica Correa told me that it was here that he saw the noren that I had shown you earlier during the Mingei slide, the traditional curtain that was hung to cover the, it usually had a circular motif in the center. And she, according to Monica, this is something that he was greatly influenced by, and that is why we see such a lot of the circular motif in his work. In Japan, his work again appears in newspapers and magazines. These are some tables and chairs that he had designed with inlay work. And he also is designing for All India Handicrafts Board and Cottage Industries by now. He starts his company Imprint, and within a few years, he becomes very well known, so much so that he ends it all at the height of his popularity because he's so much in demand and he cannot keep up. So he creates block prints, calligraphic works, saris, scarves. I have some examples in the exhibition here. You must have a look at these. This is a bed cover by him, which is very important because this is actually the backing cloth on which he took prints, and then it became something of a it became something that he utilized a lot. He made clothes with it. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any examples, but the printer that worked for him told me that these backing cloths are actually the cloth that is put on the table where the printers print, and the residue, the palimpsest residue creates its own motif, and on that he would also do his own calligraphy. So from around these times, these are some important works, the barber seal, handmade paintings, and the rug. So calligraphy becomes a really important element in his work, and these are some photographs that I have found in his archives. Calligraphy from various, scripts, and calligraphy from across the world, from different religions, in different languages. Some designs that he made for Fab India, Nalanda 2 and Likhan 1. We have some examples here in the exhibition. Amazing use of script or calligraphy. And this is something that he keeps repeating, whether it is the Namavali or whether you see the block on the bottom left is actually a calligraphy, multiple calligraphies in Bangla superimposed upon each. And as in his, he's also part of All India Handicrafts Board, and he consults for them. And in his capacity as a consultant, he designs these amazing furniture, and this is part of his. He writes a report on the craftsman and his craft, and I'll just read out a couple of lines from here. That how does one keep traditional craft alive? How does one identify its relevance? So he goes on to talk that for craft and craftsmen in India to survive, there must be a conscious effort to revive and market the product. Craft in this country grew and flourished because what was produced was used in everyday life and the objects were functional. He talks about how the designers at the time are making the craftsmen design things that are imported but also used, or not, but not in the sense those objects are supposed to be used. So he's thinking about use of the object, but he's also thinking how to make it more contemporary, how to bring it away from its people had lost the traditional motifs. According to Jasleen Dhanija, whom I spoke with, she said at that point, a lot of the craftsmen were making very bulky, unfinished design. And here Riten brought in the influence of Jali architecture, and he added light and airiness to these pieces. Some examples of his Jali furnitures, which actually I had seen growing up in Delhi, but I never realized that these were made by Riten Mozumdar. He also designed these contemporary furnitures, which were very sleek and quite international in appearance, but also hark back to a traditional format where he's using jute or coir to make the seating arrangement. And around this time, he participates in many public and private sector projects, Gandhi Darshan being one of them. He works on pieces along with stalwarts like Jyoti Bhatt, K.G. Subramaniam, K.K. Hebbar, and others. And also, he works with a lot of architects, engineers, especially Sachdev Eggleston and Associates. This is from the Engineering Trade Fair of 1975. He designed these large-scale mobile sculptures to talk about engineering, but this was touted as the largest mobile sculpture in the world at the time, made of wood, plastic, paint, and iron. It was monumental, and it was hanging. It was an engineering feat in itself. And the building that you see is, of course, right now no more. It's been razed to the ground, making way for newer designs. So an exceptional effort by a talented designer. that's how the works appeared in newspapers and magazines. Another BHEL Asia 72 pavilion, the sheathings were designed by him, the interiors. He worked with the structural engineers, he worked with the interior decorators, with architects to come up with these plans that were integral to how design was shown as part of these large scale public projects. But he was also designing or making these works for ITDC, a lot of ITDC projects. On the left is the Ashoka Restaurant, Bangalore from 1972, and then Silk Wall murals from Akbar Hotel, 1972. The CD Fort curtain, which unfortunately caught fire in the late 2000s, and we don't have examples of this. This is the only photograph I have been able to access. But people say that visitors would go to look at the curtains, and these were all hand painted calligraphy that he did. He was part of international pavilions in Algiers, in Osaka, Japan. His work was part of the Expo 72, Expo 70. He was part of the Chandigarh, the Chandigarh pavilion. So his work was an integral part of how the design aesthetics was developing at the time. And he went from doing intimate, individual, handmade works to large-scale sculptures or projects that he would work along with, in collaboration with others. This is an example of his house that Charles Correa designed in 1972, and that's Riten Mozumdar sitting with his namdas, surrounded by his namdas. So namdas became a very, very integral and important part of his practice. A namda is actually a felted wool, and he would embroider it, block print, dye, and these felt rugs were traditionally used for floor rugs, but he did it in such a way that it became something to put on the walls, to admire, to collect. And these were in great demand. He had many exhibitions of namdas from between the 1960s to the late 70s, 80s. And they were in important collections, including the Air India collection. And the one on the right is there in our exhibition. His namdas were covered. It's on the other side of the building as you enter. And his namdas became so coveted that you can see that they were shown in magazines. They were even shown as part of this New York Times magazine. I've just found it was inside Andy Wyatt's house. The sculptor, the orange namda on the orange wall is by Riten Mozumdar. So it was something international, and especially he had these tie and dye rug shows at the Contemporary Crafts Museum, the solo show in 1971, and a group show in 1984, and also showed in Netherlands, in Denmark, and other parts of the world as well. Another important part of his practice is, of course, clothes that he designed. Again, some reference to bamboo we keep. But his clothes are very simple but striking in their geometric patterns and how he approaches design that enfolds the body and changes as they move. As Monica Correa has said, and we have this piece here, and you can see how beautiful this is, and that's the sketch of the book in his sketchbook, and it's for a princely sum of 90 rupees. He designed it, so you can see it says the selling price is 90 rupees. So his collaboration with Fab India is very important, and this is a very, very important phase of his practice, and this is something that he's very, very known for and renowned for. His designs put Fab India on the map. His designs were geometric, they were bright. And as Meena Chaudhary, who worked with him for many years, has said that every Friday new designs would come and people would queue up to buy these designs and they would just simply fly out else. And one thing you will notice is most of these designs are very bright and very stark. Uh, could this be because he was colorblind? Miss Chaudhary never realized that he was colorblind. One day, he kept asking her, "What is the shade? What is the shade of this color?" And she thought Riten Mozumdar was testing her. And after a while, she got a little bit anxious and asked him that, "Why are you asking me? Why are you testing me?" Then that's when he told her that you didn't realize I'm colorblind. So I question that what kind of color blindness did that also influence or inform the way he looked at and used color within his works. This is Bindu, and here you see target, but behind it is Bindu. So if you move around and you see that's Bindu, and this he made this for Pallavi. Bharti Sharma, before she passed away, told me that this design was made by him for Pallavi in the early 70s, but later it was also used by him for Fab India in the late 70s and 80s. This was also one of the iconic design, and many people have asked me when I've shown this work that was he influenced by Raza? But I just want to say that these works by him precede Raza's Bindu works by almost a decade. Some of his works in other collections on the left is at the Jeffrey Bawa Trust in Sri Lanka. The top right image is Monica Correa's home. The cushions that you can see are at architect Ram Sharma's home in the colored photograph on the bottom slide. These are images that I found online because I remembered seeing this in Masoom. So you see, his work is there everywhere in the 1970s. So that film, Shekhar Kapoor's 1983 film, shows some of his work at the back. And this is a more recent one, 2020 years. It's a still from A Suitable Boy. It was directed by Meera Nair, and you can see Riten's works on the wall, kind of perfectly setting the time but although this was meant to be 50s in the film, but these works are from the 70s. And I come to the last section, his calligraphic paintings on silk, which he does towards the end of his life, once he returns back to Shantiniketan in the late 80s. And these are a few handwritten lines from, they are the first lines of several Tagore poems. And he comes back to Dinanto Balai again and again. So he probably was trying out, he was writing down the poems that he might want to have, work with. And then he comes to Dinanto Balai, and that is one text that keeps repeating again and again. And as Manida or K.G. Subramaniam so beautifully says, that these are speaking abstractions, and they interweave delicate washes of color and clusters of calligraphic forms. Calligraphy was important to him, as I've shown, right from the beginning of his career. But here they become more poetic, especially as perhaps he's of a more mature worldview, and he's also looking at these poems by Rabindranath and how he looks at perhaps the dusk of his life in a sense. So for those who are watching on Zoom, I'm just quickly going to show some images of the ongoing exhibition. Right now, these are images from the ongoing exhibition. We are sitting amidst this. And I'm really glad to have been able to bring the exhibition here to Kolkata. I had shown That's Bindu behind the first exhibition I had done at Chatterjee and Lal in Mumbai. It was on a much smaller scale, but there were some pieces that were different there. And here I've been able to scale up the exhibition with a lot more information and a lot more pieces that have been accessed from collectors across India. I have, of course, talked about his practice for several years now, and I feel it's very important. And especially, I'm so grateful to this growing list of people who keep adding, information, objects, memories to this large puzzle that I'm putting together almost. That brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for this brilliant lecture. Can I do that? Hello? Okay. It felt wonderful to be able to actually clap at the end. In all these sessions, we've forgotten how to do that, right? Because we are all sitting elsewhere. So this was a true eye-opener into the career and work of this exceptional designer, Riten Mozumdar. There could be questions here from the audience, but for the sake of the larger Zoom gathering, I will begin by actually contextualizing this, the work of Riten Mozumdar within some of the larger conceptions and ideas about what constitutes design, what is specific about design as against art or craft, which the opening lecture Ashok Chatterjee, which I hope many of you here had the opportunity to hear, laid open for us, often as a provocation, but also as something to think about. So I will have very little to add in terms of how Ushmita really laid out a very broad canvas, taking us back to the Swadeshi period, into post-independence India, into the age of the great industrial fairs, pavilions, and traces his career back to his retirement and retreat in Shantiniketan. What I thought I would do is really pose a couple of questions of this artist, sculptor, who becomes and then turns his designed work into artworks again. So here we are dealing with a trajectory where he moves into different areas, from textile designing into fabric, calligraphy, furniture, till his design works become like a work of art to be hung on a wall. And here the Namda series is something I was particularly interested in, where he takes a functional object like a rug and then invests his designs in them so that they're not meant to be rugs anymore. He makes them so that they be hung on a wall. Now, I raise this question because if you remember, Ushmita, one of the things that Ashok Chatterjee raised was about authorship and anonymity in design. One of the things he wanted to argue that because design somewhere mediates between craft and art, often the designer is not one who can claim authorship. He said this partly because he also said that design is always collaboration. It is always teamwork. Now, here also I'm wondering that a lot of the work he does in terms of printing technology, woodwork, is clearly collaborative work too. When he's working with the craftspeople in Nepal, he's learning from them. But by the time he's reaching the peak of his career in design, it carries his imprint. So the term imprint is very important here. So somewhere from collaboration and collective work, again, it becomes an authorial object. So anonymity is then turned around by his individual signature style. The collectivity again is there, but it becomes again a Riten Mozumdar product. And then the final thing, of course, is the functional quality. Now, here again, it's very interesting that a lot of the work he does is very clearly functional. It is textiles meant to be dress material, meant to be cushion covers, bedspreads. That's the way in which he works for whether the All India Handloom Board or the different textile companies. When he's doing pavilion design, he's catering to certain effects of pavilion. But it is when his designs become collectibles, which the Namda works are, and much of them are, that his work is no longer functional. It has reached a point where, as design, it almost has the status, and I was reminded so much, not just of a Raza painting, but so much of Bauhaus art, for instance, which is abstracted, minimalist, often geometric and design oriented, and they serve no other function except to be viewed, except to be appreciated and placed on a wall. Now, I'm raising these three questions because they were quite crucial to our inaugural lecture in terms of trying to categorize and define design. And I felt here is an instance of then design turning into fine art of kind, where the distinction between art, craft, and design again dissolves. But nonetheless, Riten Mozumdar is working with the identity and vocation of a designer. He begins as artist sculptor, he sees himself as artist sculptor, and at the end of his life, he returns to calligraphic painting. He no longer works with fabric or wood and other textures. So these are the 3 points I wanted to place before you, the larger group who may be listening to this, but also to the audience here. To me, this is very, very interesting because it complicates so much of what we assume in terms of this transition from artist to designer. A designer is necessarily one who works for clients, who works for firms, but a designer then, like Riten Mozumdar, can also then move beyond all of this and then become a person whose works sell like an artist's works sell. So I thought this was a very, very important trajectory that you mapped. You could respond to any of these, but I also had a specific question, which is that what allows him to move into a world of international collaboration and modernist design with the kind of ease and flourish that he does? What allows him to move into the international arena? You know, when he initially goes for training to Sweden, to Japan, to Finland, but he seems to be moving in league with a lot of the big international names in design. So the fact that as a designer, he becomes an international celebrity of kind. So I'm thinking it's like artists also become, but he's quite unique in the way in which he's able to straddle that international. You know, so maybe you could comment a bit on what you think were his networks, his access to that world.
So I think I think the early designers or his contemporaries like Shonari or Nelly Sedna, who later joins NIT, they all start out as individuals, right? They are individuals trying to find a way, trying to find different languages, trying to find different ways of functioning within a newly forming field. Hence, it still has not got that anonymity of a large workforce. And most of them either start their own small businesses or mini boga, for instance. So people remember mini boga and Tha. Right? So, so I think in that sense, that that period of the early eras where the new design networks are forming, it's the time for individual development. And many of them do come from, do go abroad and study. So, they bring back that ethos as well. And I think also, I think it was when they studied in Shantiniketan, he was prepared for a certain approach to art thanks to his understanding of the world, because he's written it that Vinod Bihari read him for giving an understanding of the Western art. Was teaching. So I think in a sense they were prepared. And then his work itself gave him, propelled him to be able to go abroad and study. And I think that kind of made it more easier to access those networks. Um, Also, I think the architects, like he becomes friends with Charles Taylor. And then his brother-in-law is Johnny Boyer. So he's also connected to the Shilpi and the advertising world. So there are these networks, and as we saw in Shobhuji Rai's talk as well, that individual elements or individual designers were also important as much as the collaborative design practices. So I think that's a very interesting, that anonymity was there, but that was, I think, more in the craft sector. But the design sector, as it was growing, it was more focused on individuals.
A small point before we take some questions from all of you. I think you made a very important point about thinking of this particular figure of the artist designer. And I think it's that hyphenated term that Riten Mozumdar and others may or may not have necessarily used, but that is where the figure of the architect who you brought up, because in a way, in post-independence India, it's architecture which is really laying a map of what we may call high design, where international collaboration is first coming in, right? So you're inviting the foreign expert in, Corbusier, Louis Kahn, and all of them. And these are master designers. So architecture is that field of master design. Huh? So Habib Rahman is trained under Walter Gropius. The textile designer usually isn't. And that is very interesting that with textile design, you're really dealing with blocks and weaves and looms. But many of them assume that stature, maybe not as immediately, and often it's through their association with the works of architects. And that is where pavilion design, I think, becomes very important, where architecture and other design and other medium come together. So I think it is important then to then think about many layers of what we think of this mediation where art, craft, and design, and I think that's an ongoing interest of this larger symposium we are speaking, that they each of them are distinct fields. One is drawing on the other. In a place like Shantiniketan, all three are coming together. But often design education as such is not taking off. It remains a blend. It's an NID that experiment of making design a professional practice comes about. But it's very interesting then to reflect on these figures outside architecture who are working with furniture, with textile, who by the 60s and 70s, having done pavilion design, are now developing a signature style. So from all his work with the handloom boards, cottage industries where he may or may not have had the same thing. It is with Fab India that it almost becomes a singular Riten Mozumdar enterprise. So I think what perhaps distinguishes design here as against artwork is the setting up of a commercial enterprise. I think this often becomes the marker. It is as individual, almost artists, but as designers.
Going back to that idea that I showed about Mingei, where you are mass producing, but ultimately it is also the individual potter or craftsman who
is doing,
who's doing that and who's considered a master craftsman.
Exactly. So there's fine craft and there's fine design, I suppose, if we use that word at all, or high design that we can use. Anyway, so no, I think it's really thrown open through this one individual career, an exceptional career, how he traverses all these kinds of,
Yeah. We do have other parallel examples. There's Hakusha, there's Rashid Patel, there's Mehdi Setham's exhibition was just mounted. And I'm sure there are others whose careers are just waiting to be explored. Anybody has any questions or observations? No. Okay, then, thank you very much. And please do log in to those who are joining us online for our next series on design histories. So there's one question. How do we make the butterfly dress? So, as far as I understand, and from what Bharti said, that they used two ways. One was make the dress and then do the block prints. The other was cut out the shape, lay it on the bed, arrange the blocks, and then stitch it. So these are the two methods that he's using. But these are all block prints, and most of the blocks were made by his trusted block makers that he worked with for a very long time. And even so let me tell a little bit about the Fabia bed covers, especially these large bed covers like Target. That I think it is that. So, which is a little hidden by our screen right now. But even these bed covers are actually the lines are all by block, and then each one is hand painted. So it was a labor-intensive process. It is not how we understand, and I don't think this would be possible because each one would need to be washed in running water, and even these langas needed to be washed in running water.
But what Fab India does is then popularize this as cushion covers.
Yes, so these were usually
bed
sets.
covers, in sets. Yeah, so it enters in a way the household as objects.
So Fab India employed printers in Delhi. I have met one of the printers who worked on these. He has a lot of the blogs, and so a lot of the work was done in and around Delhi, and especially near the Yamuna, because these needed to be washed in the running water. Hence, at a later period, this kind of methodology was stopped. But there are some designers in India who find alternative ways of doing these kind of works by building a kind of a layout where the water is recycled. But these were done in Delhi. No, none of these are natural dyes. These are mostly acid dyes. Towards the end, when he was doing his calligraphy paintings, he did do a series of natural dye works, but that was because there was this gentleman who came and helped him made the dies for him. There's also Darshan Shah in Kolkata who did a workshop where Riten made a series of works with that's yes, yes. But not otherwise not. But I'm also interested in
the way once they become central cottage industries or Fab India products. So for several years, I had this kind of target designed cushion covers without really knowing that I was, we use them as everyday objects. As you said, they appear in households, a particular kind of household. So there's also the training of taste, which we were talking about, where you're educating the consumer in certain kinds of, furnishing, clothes material and all. But nonetheless, then there's again a very interesting transaction between that which is being acquired by collectors and then that which circulates as objects of middle class consumption. And it seems his work feeds into both.
Yes. Also, interestingly, I mean, the earlier designs in Fab India did not carry the signature. But the designs were, in a way, Riten Mozumdar designs. They were signature designs, and they were copied, knockoffs were being sold in local Delhi markets. So then Fab India came up with the idea of adding the signature print. So designs later, so these bed covers, some of the cushions here, we have yes, but then, as Neeraj said, that the signature was also copied. So there's always this notion of what is designer and what is not. Anything else? Anybody has any other question? Thank you. It's really. Oh, thank you. Thank you all for coming.